Imagine this? Jesus was warning us about this moment. But what if the lessons you thought you knew were only shadows of a deeper truth? His insistence on love, his urgency in parables, and the warnings everyone memorized were never meant for the masses, but for those who could see patterns beneath the surface. What he tried to signal was not faith, not miracles, not salvation alone. It was a map of reality itself, a threshold where understanding changes everything. If you're ready to see what most missed, this is your chance to listen closely. Wherever you're watching or listening from, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the insight Jesus encoded for those willing to notice. Stay with me. What you're about to hear could completely change how you see the world. Jesus left a warning hidden in plain sight. A message never meant for everyone, only for those who truly noticed. Are you ready to uncover it? I grew up believing I already knew who Jesus was, not because I had studied deeply, but because the story was everywhere. It was in churches, books, holidays, and quiet assumptions passed down without effort. Jesus was faith. Jesus was salvation. Jesus was moral instruction. Love your neighbor. Forgive your enemies. Believe and be saved. It felt complete, sealed, resolved long before I was old enough to question it. I never felt curious about him. Curiosity only appears when something feels unfinished. This did not. The story had answers before questions could form. When people spoke about Jesus, they spoke with certainty, not discovery. I absorbed that certainty like air. I did not test it. I lived inside it. When life went wrong, the explanation was simple: have more faith. When people suffered, the answer was patience. When the world felt unstable, the response was prayer. Everything had a place. Everything had a reason. Or so I thought. There was comfort in that structure, and comfort rarely invites scrutiny. I believe Jesus came to save humanity from sin, from punishment, from itself. I believed his urgency was compassion, his warnings metaphorical, his parables poetic rather than precise. I believed love was a virtue, not a mechanism. I believed understanding was encouraged, even rewarded. Nothing in the version I inherited suggested restraint, but there were moments I ignored. Small moments. Verses that felt oddly tense. Repetitions that felt unnecessary. Phrases about being awake, watching, listening. Statements about those who had ears but could not hear. I assumed they were spiritual flourishes. Dramatic emphasis. Nothing more. Looking back, that assumption now feels convenient. I never asked why Jesus spoke, as if time mattered, as if something irreversible could happen, as if delay carried consequences. I never asked why clarity was avoided when clarity would have helped. I never asked why love was repeated so insistently, almost urgently, rather than explained. I accepted the version of Jesus that required nothing beyond belief. And belief is easy. It asks for loyalty, not awareness. It asks for agreement, not responsibility. At the time, I thought that was enough. I thought the story was finished. I did not know it was incomplete by design. And I did not yet understand that some truths are not hidden to confuse, but to protect. I would learn that later, when certainty finally began to crack. Much later. The discomfort did not arrive suddenly. It surfaced quietly, the way pressure builds without sound. I began noticing it when familiar passages returned to my mind, words I had heard countless times, yet never weighed. Jesus spoke often, as if time itself were fragile. His tone carried urgency, not panic, but insistence, as though delay itself carried weight. I noticed how frequently he repeated the same cautions. Stay awake. Watch. Be ready. The language was not comforting. It was alert. It implied consequence, not symbolism. I realized I had always assumed urgency meant compassion, a teacher eager to help before it was too late. But that explanation no longer satisfied me. Why warn people who are already listening? Why repeat instructions if understanding was simple? Why speak of doors closing, lamps running out, seeds failing to take root? These were not poetic flourishes. They described conditions. They described moments that pass. What unsettled me most was what he did not say. He rarely explained why urgency mattered. He did not describe the outcome in detail. He gestured toward it, circled it, then stepped away. The silence felt intentional, not omission, restraint. I began to sense a pattern. Whenever questions approached something final, the language softened or fractured into parable. Meaning was distributed, not delivered. Understanding was slowed. It was as if full clarity would have caused damage. I wondered when I first dismissed that instinct. Perhaps because urgency is uncomfortable. It demands response. It demands presence. It denies neutrality. Belief allows distance. Urgency does not. The more I reread, the more I felt that Jesus was not preparing people for death, but for timing. He spoke as if certain moments could not be revisited, as if awareness arriving too late would be useless. That possibility disturbed me more than any promise of judgment. If nothing irreversible was approaching, urgency would be unnecessary. If everything reset, warnings would be redundant. And yet the warnings were everywhere, layered beneath familiarity, disguised as morality. That was when unease replaced comfort. Not fear, but recognition. A quiet sense that the story I inherited had been simplified, perhaps intentionally. I had mistaken reassurance for truth, and something in those words had been asking for attention all along. I did not yet understand what moment he feared, only that the warning was aimed forward, patiently waiting for recognition from those willing to notice it. I returned to the teachings I thought I knew best. The phrases came easily, almost automatically, as if memorized by muscle rather than mind. Love your enemies. Do not worry about tomorrow. The kingdom is within you. I realized how effortlessly I could recite them, and how rarely I had paused to consider what they demanded. Repetition had dulled their edges. Familiarity had transformed instruction into decoration. I had treated the words as assurances rather than signals. Each saying felt complete on its own, requiring no further engagement. I believed remembering them was the same as understanding them. But when I slowed down, something shifted. These teachings were not conclusions. They were prompts. They were designed to interrupt ordinary thinking, not comfort it. Yet they had been polished smooth by centuries of repetition, sanded down until they fit easily into routine belief. I noticed how often difficult statements were softened by interpretation. Warnings were reframed as metaphors. Instructions were reduced to values. The unsettling parts were explained away, not confronted. What remained was a version that asked for agreement instead of attention. The more I examined the words, the more conditional they appeared. Watch or you will miss it. Prepare or you will be unready. Listen or you will not hear. These were not symbolic threats. They described consequences of inattention. They assumed something could be overlooked permanently. I began to understand how repetition can become a form of forgetting. When words are heard too often, they stop being questioned. They become background noise, present but inactive. I had memorized the warnings so thoroughly that I no longer felt warned. What troubled me most was realizing this was not accidental. The teachings survived, but their urgency did not. They were preserved as text while stripped of tension. It allowed belief without disruption. It allowed faith without change. And so the warnings remained, spoken aloud by millions, yet rarely examined. I had been one of them, repeating what I was taught, confident I understood. Only now did I sense that understanding had never been the goal. Readiness had been. That realization lingered quietly, unsettling but persistent. It suggested the teachings were never meant to explain, only to position the listener. Something was coming, something that required preparation, not belief. And I suspected we had been practicing memory, when we should have been practicing awareness all along, waiting without knowing. At first I resisted the idea that love could be anything other than emotion. That was how it had always been presented to me. A feeling, a virtue, a moral preference. You were kind because love made you kind. You forgave because love softened you. It sounded gentle and optional, but the insistence bothered me. Jesus did not suggest love. He repeated it. He returned to it relentlessly, even when it did not fit the situation. Love enemies. Love without reward. Love when it costs you. The emphasis felt disproportionate if love were merely an attitude. I began to sense that love was not being offered as comfort but as instruction. Not a feeling to cultivate, but a state to maintain. It appeared wherever instability threatened. It appeared where fear might accelerate. It appeared where reaction would normally take over. At the time, I could not explain why this distinction mattered. I only knew that emotion rises and falls. It cannot be relied upon. It fluctuates with circumstance. If love were required only emotionally, it would fail under pressure. Yet the instruction remained absolute. Much later, after my encounter with Elnar, the meaning clarified. Love was never presented as sentiment. It was presented as alignment, a stabilizing condition that slowed destructive momentum. Where fear compressed attention, love dispersed it. Where anger narrowed perception, love widened it. This was not poetry. It was function. Love reduced amplification. It interrupted feedback loops. It created space between stimulus and response. In systems terms, it lowered volatility. In human terms, it prevented collapse. That was why Jesus returned to it again and again. Not because humanity was cruel, but because it was reactive. Love was the counterweight. Without it, understanding would accelerate consequences too quickly. Knowledge without love would destabilize everything it touched. I realized then why explanation had been withheld. Teaching love was safer than teaching mechanics. Love slowed the listener. It bought time. It preserved coherence until humanity could carry more without breaking. This reframing unsettled me. It meant love was not optional. It was infrastructural. Remove it, and everything else failed. The warnings, the urgency, the restraint, all pointed back to this single requirement. Love was not the message. It was the condition that made all other messages survivable. And that realization quietly marked the beginning of understanding rather than belief. A shift that could not be reversed ever. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No lights, no voices, no visions. The fracture was smaller than that, almost polite. I noticed it during an ordinary afternoon, when time behaved incorrectly, slipping just enough to draw my attention without warning suddenly. I checked the clock before standing up, then again after sitting back down. The difference was impossible. Minutes were missing. Not lost in distraction, not forgotten, simply absent, as if they had never occurred at all to my awareness fully. I did not panic. Panic would have implied danger. Instead, there was confusion, quiet and persistent. I replayed the moments carefully, searching for explanation. None fit. Memory did not blur. It ended cleanly, like a sentence cut short without reason. For days I tried to dismiss it. Fatigue, stress, imagination. But the unease returned whenever I thought about it. Reality felt intact, yet thinner, as if a seam had loosened. Something had slipped through without tearing anything visible behind me. What unsettled me most was not the missing time, but my reaction. I felt observed, not watched, but noted. as if the anomaly itself had noticed me noticing it, and that awareness lingered longer than the event itself. Quietly, afterward, I began paying attention to memory in a new way. Small inconsistencies surfaced. A conversation I remembered clearly had no trace. An action I was sure I completed was undone. The world corrected itself, but my certainty did not agree. Nothing repeated exactly, yet the sense of fracture remained. Normality resumed, but trust did not. I stopped assuming continuity. I watched moments arrive and leave more carefully, aware that something had already demonstrated its ability to interrupt quietly at will. I did not tell anyone. Explaining it would have diminished it. The experience was not dramatic enough to share, yet too precise to ignore. It sat inside me, unresolved, quietly waiting, like a door left slightly open without explanation anywhere. Looking back, that fracture was an introduction. Not contact, not revelation, just permission. It signaled that the surface of things was not sealed. Something could pass through, alter nothing obvious, and still change everything underneath without leaving evidence behind anywhere. I did not yet know who would explain it, or why. I only knew something had acknowledged me first. Normal reality had cracked politely, and whatever waited beyond that crack had taken careful note of my attention in silence, patiently. The presence did not arrive the way I expected. There was no interruption, no shift in light or sound. It simply became apparent, as if something that had always been there stepped slightly forward. Awareness sharpened without fear. I knew I was no longer alone, yet nothing in the room had changed. I did not see Elnar at first. Seeing was not the point. The awareness preceded form. It felt observational, patient, and precise. Not curiosity, not concern, more like measurement, as if something was quietly confirming that I had noticed the fracture correctly. What struck me most was the absence of pressure. There was no command to listen, no demand for belief. The presence did not announce importance. It did not seek acknowledgement. It waited. And in that waiting, I felt examined rather than addressed. Time behaved normally again, yet my attention did not. Thoughts slowed, not by force, but by allowance. I became aware of my own reactions forming before they completed. That awareness felt borrowed, as if temporarily shared with something else. I understood then that authority was unnecessary. Whatever observed me did not need compliance. It did not argue. It did not persuade. Its certainty was not asserted. It was assumed. That assumption was unsettling in a way no threat could have been. I sensed that Elnar was not entering my space, but intersecting it, as if two layers briefly overlapped, allowing perception without intrusion. The presence did not feel external. It felt adjacent, close without closeness. I searched internally for fear and found none. Only curiosity restrained by caution. The presence responded to that balance, remaining steady, unchanged. It was clear that panic would have ended the overlap. Calm allowed it to continue. Nothing was communicated directly. No images, no words. Only the unmistakable knowledge of being observed intentionally, not randomly, not collectively. Specifically, when the awareness receded, it did so gently, leaving no trace except certainty. I knew then that the fracture had not been accidental. It had been an opening, and something had been waiting patiently for me to notice before stepping into alignment, silently. That quiet observation marked the beginning of contact, though no exchange occurred. I remained unchanged outwardly, yet inwardly something recalibrated, as if a reference point had been set. Whatever Elnar was, it now knew I was ready to notice more without knowing what readiness truly meant. The understanding did not arrive as contradiction. It arrived as removal. Something I had assumed essential was quietly set aside, and in that absence, clarity appeared. The belief that Jesus came primarily to save humanity had shaped everything else. It framed urgency as mercy and warnings as reassurance. When that frame loosened, the structure beneath became visible. Elnar did not negate salvation, it simply displaced it. Salvation was not denied, only demoted. It was an outcome, not a purpose. The difference mattered. Purpose explains behavior. Outcome merely follows it. Jesus behaved like someone trying to delay, stabilize, and prepare, not rescue at the final moment. I realized how much comfort the idea of saving provided. It removed responsibility. If rescue was guaranteed, awareness was optional. If salvation waited at the end, attention in the present could soften. That comfort now felt engineered, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. The urgency I had sensed earlier no longer pointed toward judgment. It pointed toward timing. Certain moments require readiness, not belief. Missing them does not result in punishment. It results in misalignment. That distinction felt precise and unsettling. Elnar's presence made something else clear. Salvation implies failure has already occurred. But the warning suggested prevention. You do not prevent what is already lost. You slow what is accelerating. You stabilize what is unstable. You guide what still responds. I began to see Jesus less as a redeemer and more as a regulator. Someone attempting to keep a system within tolerable limits long enough for maturity to develop. Love was not compassion alone. It was damping. Faith was not belief. It was coherence. Awareness was the missing element. This reframing stripped away certainty without replacing it with despair. It replaced comfort with responsibility. Nothing external would intervene at the last moment. No authority would override consequence. What unfolded would unfold according to alignment. That realization felt heavy, but also honest. It explained restraint. It explained parables. It explained urgency without spectacle. Salvation was never the goal. Stability was. And stability required participation, not worship. That understanding did not arrive as accusation. It arrived as a quiet correction, leaving me aware that something essential had been misunderstood all along. It also suggested that misunderstanding itself had served a purpose, buying time, delaying collapse, and allowing humanity to reach this precise moment where recognition could finally occur without destroying what remained within the fragile system. Time had always felt linear to me. Past, present, future. Cause and effect, growth and decay. I measured it by hours, days, years, and thought I understood its rhythm. But Elnar introduced a different weight. Not linearity, but compression. Not progress, but pressure. Moments did not simply arrive. They accumulated, stacked upon one another, compressing reality until consequences accelerated without warning. I tried to imagine it, but my mind insisted on straight lines. Events unfolding in sequence, each preceding the next. That assumption shattered quietly. I began to notice how small choices, unnoticed or dismissed, rippled unexpectedly. A conversation left unfinished, a hesitation, a refusal to see. These moments, seemingly trivial, gathered force. They amplified, bending circumstances into directions I had not anticipated. Time did not forgive oversight. It intensified it. Elnar did not speak these words aloud. I felt them in awareness, in a quiet insistence that something beyond chronology existed. Minutes could stretch, hours could vanish, yet the pressure of consequence remained. Acceleration was not visible, but perceptible. The weight of outcome arrived before the event fully manifested. I realized why the teachings of Jesus had returned so often to vigilance. Watch, stay awake, be ready. These were not metaphors. They were instructions for navigating compression. Those who assumed linearity could not prepare. They could not see when moments stacked faster than perception allowed. They could not align themselves in time that was folding inward, accelerating what they thought would be gradual. The revelation unsettled me. I had spent a lifetime trusting the clock, the calendar, the slow certainty of cause and effect. Now I saw that collapse could occur in an instant. What I considered slow decay was, in fact, often sudden. The world had always moved faster than I perceived. Only I had been untrained to notice it. I understood then why clarity was rare, why urgency seemed disproportionate, why love and awareness were emphasized above explanation. If humans responded only after observing linear progression, they would fail. Preparedness required recognition of compression. Stability required attention to accumulation before it became overwhelming. Time was never a gentle teacher. It was a force to navigate, a pressure to manage, and a condition that determined whether alignment or chaos would dominate. Belief alone could not carry anyone through it. Awareness, participation, and measured observation were essential. The realization settled quietly, unsettlingly, like the slow tightening of a coil I had never seen, and I understood that the story I had inherited had always underestimated the velocity of moments, the weight of compressed consequence, and the necessity of being awake before time demanded it. I had always thought parables were simply stories, clever metaphors, illustrations meant to make abstract ideas memorable. I had admired them for their elegance, their simplicity, their moral clarity. But now, in the quiet presence of Elnar's awareness, I understood that they were not simple at all. They were containment, not teaching, not allegory, but careful packaging. Jesus did not speak plainly because the full meaning was dangerous. Too much understanding too soon could destabilize the listener. It could accelerate consequence or collapse perception. The parables created a buffer, a space in which comprehension could grow safely, incrementally, without shattering the mind. They were instructions disguised as stories, warnings hidden in narrative, principles embedded in fiction. I considered the urgency again. Watch. Be ready. Stay awake. Those commands made sense now alongside the parables. Understanding was not meant to be immediate. Awareness was cultivated through repetition, observation, and reflection. The stories were the training wheels for perception, a method to allow the mind to adjust to realities it was not yet equipped to handle. The tension of urgency returned in new clarity. People remembered the stories, recited them, admired their elegance, but rarely felt the compression beneath them. They could repeat the words without being prepared. The buffer succeeded perfectly. Civilization continued unaware of the pressure, continuing until moments accumulated and consequences pressed with the weight of inevitability. I thought about what would happen if parables were unnecessary. Direct instruction would be impossible to contain. Minds would fracture under the weight of knowledge, too vast, too immediate. The stories contained not only ideas, but also timing. They slowed comprehension to match readiness. They controlled how attention interacted with consequence. I realized then why repetition was crucial. Hearing the same story multiple times was not ritual. It was calibration. It allowed subtle patterns to emerge, allowed the mind to notice what it would otherwise ignore. Every retelling reinforced alignment without forcing insight before the proper moment. The beauty of the parables now seemed terrifying. Elegance and caution intertwined. Words were neither moral decoration nor mere instruction. They were instruments of survival. I began to understand that much of what I had inherited as comforting guidance was actually a carefully measured system to preserve stability, to delay collapse, and to teach preparation in a world where comprehension arrived slowly and consequences accelerated silently. It left me uneasy, not because of what was told, but because of what had been withheld. The stories were never gentle. They were never simple. They were a quiet, patient containment of knowledge powerful enough to shape awareness without destroying the observer entirely. And I had only just begun to notice. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was not a revelation in the conventional sense. There were no lights, no voices, no sudden clarity that demanded recognition. It was something subtler, more insistent. A principle revealed itself. And with that revelation, the world around me began to respond differently, almost immediately. I realized that understanding was not neutral. Certain knowledge, once grasped, could not remain abstract. It carried weight, consequence, and effect. I tried to recall the moment precisely, but memory itself seemed to have adapted, rewriting the event to highlight its significance rather than its sequence. I understood something I had always assumed was theoretical, that the mind, once aligned with a new truth, begins to act in ways the old mind could not. Behavior shifted without intention. Decisions I would have made differently before now felt automatic, as if the principle had rewritten the path before me. Elnar's presence had prepared me for this, though I had not realized it at the time. Observation without instruction, awareness without demand. All of it had quietly configured my perception, creating a receptivity to understanding that could alter reality without magic, without force, without spectacle. The lesson was practical. The change was immediate. Understanding itself became a lever, a tool, a pivot. I noticed it first in small ways. A conversation I had expected to falter unfolded smoothly, the right words appearing without effort. A plan that would have failed found subtle openings. Obstacles shifted or vanished as if they had been waiting only for recognition to meet them. My awareness had aligned with a system I had not known existed, and the system began to bend around me. Not in obedience, not in favor, but in consequence. It was unsettling to realize that knowledge could act independently of will. Understanding was not a passive gift. It demanded participation. Not externally, but internally. The moment comprehension occurred, the mind reorganized itself, adjusting attention, focus, and action. The world did not bend whimsically. It responded according to principles I had only begun to perceive. Patterns emerged where I had seen chaos. Outcomes that had seemed immutable became contingent on how attentively, how accurately, I perceived and applied what I understood. I thought of Jesus again, of the urgency, of the insistence on love, on awareness, on vigilance. The instructions were not abstract ideals, they were protocols. Protocols designed to prepare the mind to recognize truths that would immediately interact with reality. Teachings were never passive. They were instruments of alignment, conditioning the mind to receive knowledge that, when grasped, would ripple outward. The realization unsettled me. To know was no longer neutral. To understand was no longer quiet. Each insight carried momentum, altering not just perception, but consequence. Time, behavior, circumstance, each became pliable, responsive to recognition. The danger, I realized, was not in ignorance. The danger was in incomplete understanding, in recognition without readiness, in comprehension applied without calibration. I felt that weight, subtle and relentless, pressing against the boundaries of how I had assumed the world functioned. Knowledge could shift reality, but it demanded respect. Misapplied, misunderstood, or partial, it could accelerate collapse instead of stabilization. And yet, when applied carefully, it became a tool beyond ordinary measure. I understood then that every word, every parable, every urgent teaching I had inherited had been designed for this very moment, to prepare the mind for comprehension that changes the world, quietly, immediately, irreversibly. Understanding was no longer abstract. It was action. It was consequence. and I was only beginning to feel the weight of its truth. For years I had assumed ignorance was weakness. I had assumed that what we did not know left us vulnerable, exposed to mistakes and calamities. I had measured progress by knowledge, advancement by comprehension, and assumed that delay in understanding was a liability. But Elnar revealed otherwise. Silently, insistently, without speaking. Ignorance, I learned, was not the absence of power. It was a shield, a careful buffer against consequences that would have arrived too swiftly had we understood too much, too soon. I struggled to grasp it at first. How could not knowing be protective? The world seemed full of evidence to the contrary. Mistakes, accidents, failures. Yet, as I reflected on history, on the cycles that had always repeated, I began to see the pattern. Humans often acted too early, too confidently, in response to knowledge they partially grasped. Misapplication was common. Haste compounded error. In contrast, ignorance allowed time, allowed space for stabilization. It delayed the inevitable, creating a fragile breathing room that comprehension alone could not have afforded. Elnar's presence reminded me that timing was everything. Knowledge applied too soon could accelerate collapse. Awareness without preparation could fracture perception, destabilize society, and magnify unintended consequences. Ignorance, by contrast, prevented premature action. It was not random. It was purposeful. The delay it created was neither accidental nor punitive. It was containment, just as the parables contain truth. The mind, unprepared, could not handle full comprehension. Consequences, compressed and relentless, would have arrived like an avalanche. Humanity, unready, would have shattered. I thought of the teachings I had inherited, the warnings I had memorized but never fully internalized. Every admonition, every insistence on vigilance, every call to love and awareness had operated within this protective framework. Humans had been granted time, however fragile, to reach a point where comprehension would be useful rather than destructive. Urgency, repetition, and instruction were scaffolding, not rescue. It left me unsettled, not because the world was dangerous, but because I realized how carefully calibrated our ignorance had been. We had been observing, learning, and failing within limits deliberately imposed. Collapse had been delayed, not prevented. The potential for disaster always existed. Knowledge had been held back not to deceive, but to safeguard. Humanity had survived through incompleteness, through partial vision, through not seeing the full weight of what consequences might bring. I felt both gratitude and unease. Gratitude for the protection I had never recognized, and unease for the responsibility that awaited now that comprehension was possible. Ignorance had been a cushion. Now that the cushion was thinning, preparation became essential. Understanding was no longer passive. Consequences were accelerating. The weight of insight pressed down. And I realized that humanity had not been unready for everything. It had been protected from everything that would have destroyed it before it was ready to bear the knowledge, and perhaps the burden of alignment that knowledge required. I had always thought of love as fragile, personal, subjective, something to be felt, expressed, or withheld. A bond, a sentiment, a choice. I never considered it a mechanism, a regulator, a fail-safe. But Elnar's quiet presence, persistent and patient, made me understand that love was far more than emotion. It was functional. It was structural. It operated like a hidden current beneath every interaction, every thought, every hesitation. Its absence allowed chaos to accelerate. Its presence tempered consequence before disaster could crystallize. I began to observe it in ways I had never noticed before. A kind word, a patient gesture, even the acknowledgement of another's existence. It created resonance, subtle but measurable, within the immediate environment. Tiny acts of care, previously dismissed as sentimentality or ritual, became stabilizing forces. They dampened impulses, slowed the spread of anger, countered the multiplication of fear. They were like anchors holding a ship steady in a storm that humans did not fully perceive. Elnar did not explain this in words. The understanding arrived in observation. He allowed me to see interactions that I would have overlooked, to sense the subtle changes that occurred when someone responded with intention rather than reaction. Love was never sentimental. It was deliberate. It required attention. It required awareness. It was a regulator applied through choice, discipline, and perception. I thought of the teachings of Jesus again. Insist on love. Love your neighbor. Turn the other cheek. I had always interpreted them as moral guidance, ethical aspiration. Now I saw them as instructions for system stability. They were designed to slow the destructive amplification inherent in human interaction. Every insult absorbed, every grievance set aside, every moment of empathy allowed the system to recalibrate. Love was a failsafe, engaged not through obligation, but through mindful practice. The urgency of this realization weighed on me. Love was not optional. It was not a luxury for the moral or the spiritual. It was a necessary function. The absence of it accelerated consequences in ways I could feel but not yet measure. Anger, fear, judgment, unchecked, moved like a chain reaction, destabilizing thoughts, actions, and environments. Love introduced a buffer. It created resistance to collapse. I began to sense the consequences of neglect. When humans acted without consideration, without care, systems destabilized. Not always visibly, not immediately, but the pressure built, unnoticed until the moment of rupture arrived. Love, applied consciously, reduced the force of impact. It did not erase risk, but it delayed the acceleration of failure. It bought time, space, and opportunity. And then I understood why Jesus insisted upon it with such repetition and insistence. It was not moral exhortation. It was instruction for survival. Humanity had been given knowledge, urgency, and opportunity. But love was the failsafe, the regulator that allowed systems to endure, even as consequences compressed and awareness expanded. Without it, preparation alone was insufficient. With it, even incomplete comprehension could prevent catastrophe. Love was the quiet mechanism keeping chaos at bay, the subtle counterbalance to human unpredictability, the invisible anchor in a world pressed by forces too complex to be seen. And I realized that understanding its function was as essential as understanding any principle. Fear is deceptively simple. It seems personal, contained, a reaction to immediate threat. But Elnar revealed to me that fear was not merely reactionary. It was exponential. It scaled, amplified, and multiplied through the smallest openings in attention, through the mechanisms of society, and through the tools humans had created to communicate, observe, and record. What one mind felt alone could ripple into thousands, then millions, then entire systems. Without intervention, it was self-sustaining once given focus, and it required no conscious propagation to accelerate. I had never considered the mechanics of it before. I had experienced fear as a visitor, a momentary shadow, a tightening in the chest. I had not realized it was a force with its own momentum, a kind of gravity that drew attention, shaped behavior, and reshaped perception. The mind becomes both generator and amplifier. What begins as a small worry, a minor anticipation, could radiate outward, touching every interaction, every network of observation, until the system itself trembled. Elnar did not speak of fear as moral or emotional. He framed it as physics. Attention is energy. Observation is force. Fear, when combined with technology, with collective focus, becomes feedback. It repeats itself. It reinforces itself. Even attempts to dispel it, when uncalibrated, can intensify it. Humans often responded to fear with action, but action was frequently misaligned. The fear then used the response to grow, to reinforce its presence, to secure a foothold where previously there was none. It did not need malice, it needed focus. I began to see it in subtle patterns. Headlines, repeating the same anxiety. Conversations feeding off speculation. Social structures tuned to crisis rather than clarity. The amplification was relentless because it was invisible. Fear was a system designed to sustain itself. The more it was noticed, the stronger it grew. Even ignoring it was a form of fuel, because what was neglected festered in shadows, waiting for attention to release it with greater force. The terrifying clarity of this realization left me unsettled. Humanity had built mechanisms of observation and communication that unintentionally accelerated the very pressures it feared. The mind's instinct was to respond, to act, to fix. But the systems created to aid response were also perfect conduits for exponential amplification. Fear became a networked organism, invisible yet tangible, subtle yet unstoppable once initiated. I understood then why Jesus had emphasized vigilance, presence, and awareness. Fear could not be faced directly, and it could not simply be dismissed. One had to understand its mechanics, recognize its patterns, and consciously regulate attention to prevent the spread. Love, focus, and awareness were not moral suggestions, they were containment tools. Without them, fear would multiply unchecked, becoming self-sustaining, growing faster than comprehension, faster than preparation, faster than any ordinary human could counter. I sat quietly, absorbing the weight of it. The mind is not merely reactive, it is generative. And when fear finds the energy it needs, it becomes a force independent of morality or circumstance, exponential, self-reinforcing, and merciless. It moves through thought, technology, and collective focus. The question lingered. How many patterns of collapse had already been seeded, unseen, waiting only for attention to release them? I understood now that vigilance was not about bravery. It was about understanding the architecture of fear and learning how to prevent it from consuming the systems it inhabits. The feeling came first, subtle, like a vibration beneath perception. I could not see it, could not touch it, but I sensed it pressing against the edges of awareness, a weight folded into the ordinary flow of days. Elnar never announced it. He allowed me to feel the compression before revealing its context. The present moment was not ordinary. It was a junction, a convergence, a point where forces long in motion intersected with consequence. Jesus had anticipated this. He had seen it coming, not in dates, not in headlines, but in patterns, rhythms, and human tendencies that would inevitably align to this exact inflection. It was not dramatic. There were no flashing signs, no alarms, no singular catastrophe. The convergence was subtle, cumulative, and entirely dependent on perception. Most of humanity would pass through it unaware, guided only by repetition, habit, and the comforting inertia of ignorance. Yet for those who observed, who remembered, who understood, the pattern could not be ignored. It was as though a line had been drawn across time itself, invisible to the untrained eye. And all events, all human focus, converged upon it like water draining into a single basin. I began to notice it in small ways, almost accidentally. Moments of tension appearing simultaneously in unrelated places. Decisions made instinctively by strangers, echoing choices I had considered days before. Information arriving in patterns I could not trace. There was a compression of consequence, a sense that events, people, and thoughts were moving faster than normal, yet without visible acceleration. The world felt both familiar and strangely orchestrated. The ordinary and the extraordinary had become inseparable, layered over one another like sheets of reality vibrating at slightly different frequencies. Elnar guided me silently through observation. He did not speak of what would occur, only of what could be seen if one paid attention. Patterns converged, consequences compressed, decisions multiplied. The ordinary gestures of human life, the exchanges, the arguments, the kindnesses, and cruelties were magnified beyond awareness. What had been minor now carried weight. What had been ignored now influenced outcomes in ways previously unimaginable. Time itself felt elastic, bending subtly to the demands of the convergence. Jesus had anticipated this, not as prophecy, not as prediction, but as recognition of the inevitable alignment of systems, minds, and intentions. Every teaching, every insistence on love, vigilance, and discernment had been preparation. The parables, the repetitions, the insistence on attention. These were not moral instructions, but frameworks for survival, protocols for navigation through a moment in time where ordinary comprehension would fail unless the mind was conditioned to perceive and respond. I felt the pressure of it in my chest, in the rhythm of thought, in the pattern of observation. The convergence demanded awareness, demanded calm, demanded the ability to recognize the invisible architecture of cause and consequence. The moment was here, quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it was nothing less than the pivot Jesus had foreseen. And I understood that for humanity, most would continue unaware. Most would move through it without recognition. But for those who observed, who remembered, who paid attention, it was the threshold, the moment where preparation met consequence, and where understanding became a tool that could shape what unfolded. The present was no longer ordinary. It was the moment anticipated, and awareness itself was the only lever capable of navigating it. I had always imagined miracles as evidence, proof of authority, demonstrations of power meant to convince, to awe, to cement belief. I had imagined them as spectacular, unavoidable, unambiguous. Elnar showed me that I had been entirely wrong. Miracles were not proofs. They were measured interventions, precise, calibrated, and scarce. They were designed to influence behavior, to guide attention, to catalyze comprehension without overwhelming the system they sought to stabilize. They were not about belief. They were about alignment, subtle and deliberate. The principle was simple in concept but staggering in implication. Intervention, when too abundant, accelerates consequence. A world unprepared for sudden change fractures under the weight of too much revelation. Miracles, if distributed indiscriminately, would have triggered exponential reactions. Fear, misunderstanding, misapplication, and unintended consequence would have surged like wildfire. Miracles, Elnar explained, were never meant to create awe for its own sake. They were signals, small calibrations, nudges to redirect perception, slow acceleration, or encourage practice of principles like vigilance, patience, and, above all, love. I began to see the pattern in the stories I had been told. Water turned to wine, storms stilled, the blind healed. Each event, I realized, arrived at a moment of potential destabilization. Each was subtle enough not to collapse the comprehension of the witness, but just strong enough to shift trajectory, to guide attention, to create the conditions where choice could operate constructively. The miracles were filters, not displays. They separated those who observed passively from those who engaged with awareness. They tested attention, willingness, and readiness. Miracles were not random. They were purposeful. Their rarity was intentional, their selectivity deliberate. Human perception could not absorb full causality. If it had, systems, social, mental, even energetic, would have moved too quickly. Collapse would have preceded preparation, and the momentum of fear and error would have grown uncontrollably. Miracles were contained, knowledge applied selectively, a method of engagement designed to prevent acceleration beyond capacity. I felt the weight of it. My mind had been trained to look for proof, to demand spectacle, to expect visible validation. But Elnar taught me that the extraordinary was embedded in subtlety, in the unseen, in the quiet adjustments that prevented catastrophe. Each miracle was a node, a pressure valve, a controlled release of comprehension into human experience. They were not entertainment, they were maintenance, infrastructure of alignment. I realized that what I had always sought in miracles, certainty, awe, reassurance, was precisely what they were never meant to provide. They were functional, not performative. Their rarity was protection. Their design ensured that awareness could grow, that comprehension could unfold, that consequence could be managed. And in this understanding, the very idea of proof became meaningless. Miracles were not to convince the mind. They were to train it, to prepare it, to guide it without breaking it. They were the silent architecture of stability, and understanding their purpose revealed a system of care, precision, and unseen design far beyond what I had ever imagined possible. I realized that every story, every account, every whispered account of the impossible carried a lesson in calibration. Miracles were not to be worshipped or demanded. They were to be understood as deliberate, measured adjustments to a system that could not yet bear the full weight of its own potential. And comprehension of that truth was itself a kind of miracle. I had spent years assuming that everything unsaid by Jesus was either forgotten, lost, or deliberately withheld for judgment. I had believed silence was a moral choice, a testing of faith, a call to obedience. Elnar unraveled that assumption with quiet patience. Silence, he explained, was not omission. It was restraint. It was measured containment. To explain certain truths before the necessary readiness had developed would have triggered consequences far beyond comprehension. Premature activation was dangerous. It was destabilizing. It was irreversible. I began to understand that humanity's mind, untrained and unpracticed, could not absorb certain realities without fracturing perception. The explanations I had craved would not have enlightened. They would have accelerated outcomes, released forces that were being contained, and multiplied fear faster than any comprehension could stabilize. Jesus did not refuse out of arrogance or judgment. He refused because the timing of knowledge was itself a system, and humans were not ready to navigate the system without guidance. I thought about the stories, the parables, the warnings, repeated endlessly. Each word, each omission, each carefully framed phrase was a vector of preparation. To fully explain would have meant bypassing gradual understanding, skipping the patterns that allowed human attention to adapt. Systems, both internal and external, require calibration. Awareness without readiness is like releasing water into an unprepared vessel. The flood is inevitable. Elnar guided me through examples that I could perceive but could not touch. I sensed the alignment of history, the compression of moments where knowledge, if unrestrained, would have caused collapse rather than comprehension. Certain events in human history, I realized, were buffered, delayed, intervened upon subtly. Humanity's ignorance was not accidental. It was the mechanism of preservation. Premature understanding was catastrophic. Full comprehension required readiness, attention, and restraint. I reflected on how much of what we call faith, obedience, or morality was actually preparation for comprehension. It was not about reward or punishment. It was about survival in the face of patterns too complex, too fast-moving, and too delicate for the untrained mind. Jesus had structured teachings, repeated messages, and carefully measured parables to create a scaffold. The scaffold allowed incremental awareness, gradual calibration, and the slow expansion of perception until the mind could bear truths that would otherwise overwhelm. Elnar's presence emphasized that restraint is not absence. Silence carries weight. It preserves integrity. It guides attention without forcing understanding. To reveal too much, too soon, is to break the system. To observe without interference is sometimes the greatest intervention. The unsaid words, the gaps, the questions left unanswered, these were active components of preparation, not failings. I sat with the knowledge, the sense of deliberate omission pressing against my understanding. Jesus had withheld not to control, not to punish, but to protect. The world was not ready for comprehension, and explanation itself could have been a spark too powerful to contain. Premature activation was a danger I could feel, a tension folded into the invisible architecture of human readiness, and the realization settled like a weight in my chest. Silence had been a gift, a protection, and a bridge that humanity had not yet learned to cross. I began to see the pattern clearly, though it had taken me years to notice it. Humanity had taken what was meant to be a living, active engagement with understanding and turned it into ritual and repetition. Faith had replaced practice. Belief had replaced calibration. The principles that were intended to shape attention, to regulate perception, and to slow the amplification of fear and error had been abstracted into symbols, doctrines, and rules. Responsibility, once internal and immediate, was outsourced to gods, leaders, or external authorities. The mind no longer trained itself. The soul no longer exercised vigilance. Elnar's quiet observation accompanied the revelation. He did not offer judgment. He allowed me to feel the consequence of centuries of substitution. Humans had believed that adherence to stories was equivalent to understanding, that chanting, memorizing, and repeating was a form of mastery. But comprehension does not reside in repetition. Awareness cannot be inherited. It must be exercised, tested, and integrated through observation and reflection. The substitution created a fragile system, one easily manipulated, one susceptible to acceleration, one vulnerable to collapse. I noticed it in history, in patterns both subtle and catastrophic. When responsibility was externalized, decisions were no longer tethered to consequence. Actions carried weight, but the awareness of weight had been abandoned. Fear became amplified because attention was misaligned. Systems became unstable because humans failed to calibrate themselves with reality. Love, intended as a stabilizing regulator, became sentimental rather than operative. Knowledge, intended as actionable, became inert. Each generation compounded the error. The framework designed for stability had been hollowed, leaving appearance without function, form without effect. And yet, Elnar suggested, it was not irretrievable. Awareness could be restored. Practice could replace faith. Calibration could replace blind belief, and responsibility could return to the individual. But the path was narrow, demanding, and often invisible. Most would never notice. Most would continue to live in the comfort of stories, unaware that the world itself responded to internal states, to focus, to collective attention. The misalignment amplified consequences beyond the control of any single person. The structure of reality required engagement, not worship, participation, not repetition. I felt the weight of the human mistake pressing against the present. Each unexamined habit, each outsourced responsibility, each repetition without reflection had set the stage for the moment Elnar had shown me. The convergence Jesus had anticipated. The consequences were arriving not as punishment, but as inevitable result of neglected calibration. It was the echo of inattention magnified across centuries. The revelation settled in me like a quiet, inescapable truth. Humanity had gone wrong not in moral failure, not in sin, but in misunderstanding the nature of engagement. Faith had been abstracted from action. Belief had displaced awareness. Responsibility had been externalized. The very tools meant to navigate reality had been abandoned, and the systems of consequence now moved faster than comprehension. The world had accelerated, but the eyes of humanity remained untrained, and the consequences of that neglect were now visible to those who dared to observe. I realized then that understanding the error was not blame, but a requirement. To notice was the first step in reclaiming the alignment that had been lost. The moment demanded more than recognition, it demanded internal recalibration, the quiet rebuilding of attention and responsibility, the deliberate act of seeing without substitution, of practicing without the illusion of inherited comprehension. And that act, I sensed, was the first true step toward the preparation Jesus had always intended. I began to understand the true nature of Elnar's presence, though it was unsettling to accept. He was not a savior, not a judge, not a dispenser of mercy or punishment. He carried no authority that demanded compliance. He did not intervene to alter outcomes beyond the subtlest of nudges. His purpose was observation, pure and deliberate, watching to see whether humanity could recognize its own misalignment and begin the painstaking process of self-correction. I realized that his presence alone was not a gift. It was a test, though not in the conventional sense. The test was not about obedience or belief. It was about attention, awareness, and the capacity to perceive patterns without external coercion. Everything I had assumed about intervention was wrong. Elnar did not prevent errors. He did not undo consequences. Instead, he created a field of observation that allowed the tiniest fluctuations to be recorded, noted, and understood. The focus was on human response, on how attention shifted, how perception adjusted, how internal calibration either faltered or strengthened in the face of pressures that most would never recognize. He monitored systems not with judgment, but with patience, as if the unfolding of awareness itself was the only metric that truly mattered. I thought about the patterns I had ignored, the moments of oversight and inattention in daily life that seemed trivial at the time. Each oversight, each unobserved fear, each misapplied belief contributed to acceleration, to amplification, to the hidden collapse of systems invisible to those who were untrained. Elnar's purpose was to witness whether these systems could stabilize from within, whether humans could develop the capacity to correct themselves before consequences outpaced comprehension. His role was not intervention in the human sense. It was calibration in the unseen, observation without interference, presence without domination. I realized that what had been attributed to divine oversight or providence was, in fact, a structured pattern of observation. The quiet interventions I had noticed were not miracles in the sense of suspension of natural law. They were signals, markers, and gentle feedback loops designed to test comprehension and attention. The full weight of consequence remained intact. The world moved according to cause and effect, but the observer recorded, assessed, and waited to see whether humanity could learn to navigate its own trajectory. Elnar's patience was infinite, yet precise. Every hesitation, every pause, every silence carried meaning. He did not instruct beyond subtle suggestion. He did not correct beyond the softest alignment. His work was not noticed, yet it was exacting. I began to understand that being observed was not about fear or compliance. It was about exposure to truth without distortion, about revealing patterns without forcing understanding, about leaving the possibility for self-correction intact. I felt the weight of what it meant to be under such observation. The stakes were not abstract. They were immediate and cumulative. Each thought, each decision, each unnoticed reaction contributed to acceleration or deceleration, stability or chaos. Elnar's purpose was not to save. It was to see whether the system of human awareness, if properly applied, could stabilize itself when left to its own devices. And in that realization, I understood the urgency that had threaded every warning, every parable, every insistence on vigilance and love. His presence was a mirror, reflecting the consequences of neglect and the potential of conscious alignment, and it demanded nothing more than attention, integrity, and the quiet willingness to observe oneself honestly. I began to feel it in a way that could not be ignored. The weight of thought, the pulse of collective expectation, the invisible force of attention compressing into reality, it was palpable. Elnar's words echoed, quiet but deliberate. You are amplifying what you fear. At first, I resisted the notion. It sounded too abstract, almost metaphysical. Fear was internal, subjective, personal. How could it shape the vast, sprawling systems of human consequence? And yet, the patterns were undeniable. Every time humanity focused on danger, disaster, or scarcity, the very events they anticipated seemed to accelerate, to grow, to take form with a speed and intensity that outpaced comprehension. I realized that fear was not a passive state. It was an active agent, a lens that refracted probability into certainty. Attention directed at potential collapse gave collapse energy. Anxiety concentrated on scarcity, summoned scarcity. Worry repeated in millions of minds became momentum. A current too powerful to see, but impossible to ignore. The world responded not to action alone, but to the focus of minds collectively aligned with expectation. Humanity was, without awareness, manifesting the reality it claimed to want to avoid. Elnar's presence highlighted every nuance of my own complicity. Every private dread, every fixation on what could go wrong, every unconscious rehearsal of disaster contributed to amplification. It was not punishment, it was consequence. It was the natural response of systems to the frequency of attention, the pattern of expectation, the alignment of focus with fear. The energy of avoidance became energy of creation, a feedback loop no one had trained themselves to see. I began to see the paradox threaded through history. Warnings that were ignored intensified outcomes. Prophecies that were feared became self-fulfilling. Messages intended to prepare were twisted into anxiety. Humanity had been told to observe, to calibrate, to practice vigilance and love, but instead the focus remained on avoidance, on the very thing that destabilized the system. Fear had become the engine of consequence. The more attention devoted to avoiding collapse, the faster collapse approached. And yet, within the observation lay a possibility. Awareness of amplification itself offered a subtle form of intervention. To notice that fear was creating reality was the first step toward shifting it. The lens could be redirected. Attention could be deliberately aligned with stability, with small corrective focus, with recognition of what worked rather than what failed. The energy of attention could be reclaimed, not by force, but by choice. I felt the urgency settle in my chest. Humanity had been given signals, subtle corrections, and frameworks to prevent acceleration. The lesson was not to eliminate fear entirely. That was impossible. It was to observe it, to recognize it, and to avoid feeding it unconsciously. Awareness of amplification created the margin of difference between disaster and containment, between collapse and recalibration. Fear was not merely a feeling. It was an operator. And to ignore its mechanics was to hand the keys of reality to the very outcomes humanity sought to prevent. Elnar's observation was patient, impartial, yet unyielding. He did not chastise. He simply revealed the mechanism. And in that revelation, the weight of responsibility became undeniable. To observe, to focus, to align attention deliberately was the first act of true intervention, the act that could alter not the world outside alone, but the system inside, and through that, the unfolding of consequence itself. The truth settled in me, unsettling and sharp. Humanity had been creating the outcome it feared, and to see it was the first step toward changing it. I began to feel the shape of it, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in the air that presses against the chest. Elnar spoke quietly, almost as if the words were an afterthought to the observation itself. The threshold ahead. It was not a moment of judgment. It was not the spectacle of apocalypse. It was something quieter, something far more consequential. A locking point, he said, where patterns, once established, became difficult to reverse. The world was moving along trajectories that humans had traced unconsciously, and at certain junctures, the curvature of consequence accelerated beyond ordinary intervention. The threshold was that juncture. I thought about the countless small choices, the unnoticed habits, the repetitive focus on what was feared rather than what was functional, and realized how close humanity had come to crossing such points in the past. History was full of hints, patterns repeating with a frequency unnoticed by those living them. Systems destabilized slowly at first, then rapidly once alignment shifted beyond a recoverable margin. The threshold was not a date, not a disaster. It was the accumulation of neglect, inattention, misaligned focus, and unobserved fear. Once the margin narrowed, reversal required awareness few had cultivated, and effort most were incapable of sustaining. Elnar's presence underscored the quiet urgency. He did not intervene, did not halt the acceleration, did not offer reassurance. Observation alone amplified the clarity of the warning. I felt it in my chest, a pressure that was neither fear nor panic but a somatic recognition of fragility. The threshold existed everywhere, within systems both natural and human, within minds both individual and collective. Once crossed, events followed momentum that was indifferent to morality, desire, or hope. They followed the logic of attention and amplification. I realized the subtlety of what was required. It was not enough to wish for change. It was not enough to pray or speculate or debate. The threshold demanded conscious engagement, deliberate alignment of focus, calibration of attention, and recognition of patterns before they crystallized into irreversible trajectories. Each unnoticed fear, each habitual complaint, each unobserved action contributed to the closing margin. The threshold was not distant. It was imminent, existing at the convergence of attention, choice, and consequence. And yet, Elnar's observation carried a paradoxical grace. Awareness of the threshold offered agency. To notice it was to locate the margin, to see the narrowing window, and to redirect energy before closure. Small, deliberate shifts in perception could reverberate outward, subtly adjusting outcomes, stabilizing systems, and creating space where once there was only momentum. The threshold was not absolute. It could be approached, skirted, or recalibrated through careful, conscious attention. I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me, intimate and immediate. Humanity's patterns were accelerating toward this unseen hinge, but understanding it provided leverage. The threshold was neither punishment nor reward. It was a mirror, revealing the extent to which neglect had created acceleration and the extent to which awareness could restore alignment. Elnar's quiet presence, indifferent yet meticulous, was a constant reminder. The moment ahead demanded not hope or fear, but clarity, observation, and the deliberate reclamation of attention before patterns locked irreversibly into consequence. The world waited, suspended in potential, at the edge of what could no longer be easily reversed. The moment I understood it, the revelation was both terrifying and fragile. Change was possible, Elnar explained, but not in the way anyone imagined. It was not a matter of declarations, speeches, or even belief. Humanity's grand affirmations of hope or moral resolve were irrelevant to the system. It responded only to shifts within. Internal alignment, the subtle calibration of thought and focus, created ripples that could travel outward, altering trajectories before momentum became irreversible. Everything else, the proclamations, the rituals, the arguments, were distractions. noise in a system attuned to attention and internal resonance. I thought about the countless crises that had passed unnoticed, the wars, the collapses, the cycles of fear and anticipation, and realized they had all occurred along the same principle. Patterns were amplified by what humans gave weight to, by what they considered urgent or real, and suppressed only when the internal frequency changed. It was invisible, it was quiet, and yet it was devastatingly potent. I began to see the invisible mechanisms operating across minds and systems, the way a single shift in focus could redirect currents that seemed otherwise immutable. Elnar made no gestures, no motions to illustrate the point. Observation alone was enough. He showed, through presence, how attention carried energy, how the mind's orientation could reinforce or stabilize, accelerate or collapse. I noticed it in my own reactions, the automatic spiral toward negative anticipation, the habitual rehearsals of failure. I understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable, that the system responded not to my worries, not to my predictions, not to my moral judgments, but only to subtle, intentional shifts in thought and behavior. It was an inner work, a calibration of perception, a realignment of focus. The implications were staggering. Most people did not know they were the instruments of the very outcomes they feared. Fear became creation. Misalignment became momentum. Yet the door to influence remained open, if only for those who could see the mechanism and intervene from within. Change was possible, but it required a patience that defied conventional urgency, a discipline that could not be rushed by desire or panic. The tiniest adjustments, repeated and observed, could ripple outward with consequences no declaration could replicate. I felt the weight of responsibility, intimate and inescapable. If internal shifts mattered more than belief, then my own calibration became a form of intervention. Not heroism, not moral triumph, but subtle, deliberate awareness. I could alter patterns simply by noticing, by choosing focus, by redirecting energy inward rather than outward, in fear or anticipation. The margin was narrow, but it existed. Awareness of the system and its responsiveness became the key. The rules were subtle, invisible, but consistent. The possibility of change had never been absent. It had been waiting for attention, for observation, for alignment within, and I realized, with both awe and urgency, that the inner work was the world's leverage. External chaos could rage, but internal shifts carried consequence that no external event could override. Humanity's redemption, its stabilization, its survival, existed not in rituals, not in proclamations, not in faith alone, but in the quiet, deliberate recalibration of focus, attention, and internal alignment. Change remained possible because the system always responded to awareness, and awareness, once directed with precision, could alter outcomes with a subtlety that was invisible until observed. I remember the moment clearly, though it felt suspended outside of time. Elnar left, without explanation, without instruction, without the reassurance of guidance. There was no map, no checklist, no formula to follow. His presence had been a lens, a mirror, a subtle vector pointing toward observation, and now that lens was gone. I was left with the quiet hum of possibility, the weight of what I had been shown, and the absence of direction. He did not leave because he had nothing to teach, but because teaching, in its traditional sense, would create dependence. Guidance carries consequence. Too much intervention accelerates outcomes. Too much clarity before readiness can collapse systems rather than stabilize them. His absence was intentional, protective, and infinitely demanding. The room felt different when he was gone. Not emptier, exactly, but the space carried the residue of observation, the lingering awareness that nothing had been hidden, that nothing had been forced, and that the work now belonged entirely to me. I realized the paradox of it. I had learned everything and nothing at once. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Understanding without application was inert. Action without internal recalibration was chaos. The system he had revealed did not respond to external pressure, moral urgency, or public alarm. It responded only to subtle, deliberate, internal alignment, and that alignment could not be handed over. It had to be claimed. It had to be recognized, refined, and practiced in the silence of consciousness. I walked through the house as though it had been reshaped in his absence. Every object, every sound, every flicker of light seemed to carry a question, an echo, a challenge. His departure made the invisible visible. I felt, almost physically, the threads connecting focus, fear, love, and consequence. They were taut, delicate, and under constant tension, and I understood that I could not delegate the work of attention. No teacher, no text, no ritual could substitute for the ongoing observation of my own perception, the careful calibration of thought, and the conscious shaping of energy toward alignment rather than disruption. Elnar had shown me the thresholds, the amplifications, the mechanisms by which attention became creation and fear became momentum. He had revealed the convergence of the present era, the margins where patterns could lock irreversibly, and the subtle power of internal shifts. And then he had vanished. There was no sign, no farewell, no gesture of assurance. Only the lingering imprint of his presence, like the afterimage of light, like the residue of a vibration, like the shadow of a question too vast to articulate. I understood then, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and frightening, that the world I had known would continue to unfold according to the focus of minds, the direction of attention, and the alignment of intent. The responsibility was absolute, the opportunity was immense, and the answers, the instructions I wanted, the certainty I craved, were never coming. I was left with the echo of a presence that had shown me the mechanics of reality without delivering the comfort of closure. Elnar had departed, leaving me to act, to observe, to calibrate, and to endure the strange liberation of knowing that nothing external could save what could only be cultivated within. The realization settled over me slowly, like mist rolling across a field at dawn, but it carried a weight that pressed against my chest. Jesus had never been addressing crowds in the way I had imagined. The sermons, the parables, the insistence on love, the urgency in every phrase, they were not meant for general consumption. They were signals, calibrated for those who could perceive beyond repetition, beyond ritual, beyond inherited faith. The warning had always been individual. It had always been personal. Each message a thread cast into the consciousness of someone attuned enough, someone willing to notice, someone ready to carry the understanding alone. I thought of the centuries of interpretation, of communities and institutions that claimed to contain the message, that repeated the words like a shield, a mantra, a protective incantation. All of it missed the essential mechanism, the amplification, the calibration, the observation. Those could not be mass-produced. Fear and hope, belief and obedience, ritual and tradition, none of these transmitted the threshold of understanding required to act with awareness. Only the internal shift mattered. Only the one who listened carefully, who examined the urgency behind the words, who felt the subtle pressure behind the insistence, could engage with the warning in a way that mattered. I remembered Elnar's presence, the quiet observation, the way he had allowed me to see without interference, the way he had withdrawn without instruction. Everything he had shown me, all the impossibilities, the fractures, the calibration of attention and fear and love, pointed toward the same principle. Humanity at large was not the recipient. The system was too precise, the consequences too immediate. The only way to prevent collapse, the only way to stabilize patterns that were accelerating, was through individual awareness. Each mind capable of internal alignment became a fulcrum, a subtle stabilizer in a web of unseen connections. The rest would follow only through resonance, never through coercion or mass comprehension. I sat in the quiet of my room, the echoes of Elnar's observations still vibrating in the air. The warning had never been loud. It had never been obvious. It was always subtle, encoded in urgency, in parables, in the insistence on love as regulation, not mere emotion. The warning was a call to notice, to calibrate, to act from internal alignment. The world might continue to accelerate around me. Patterns might lock and amplify. Fear might spread like wildfire. But I understood now that my responsibility was absolute, individual, and irreducible. The message was mine to carry in perception, in practice, in deliberate attention. Jesus had never expected the masses to grasp the full weight of what was unfolding. He had always aimed for the ones who could see, for the minds that could absorb urgency without panic, for the hearts that could internalize love as structure, not sentiment. And I was one of those individuals. The warning was no longer abstract, no longer inherited. It was living in me, pressing me to act within, to observe, to align, to be the subtle pivot in a system that responded only to what could be measured in attention, in awareness, in internal change. And in that quiet, I finally understood. The warning had never been for everyone. It had been for me, and it would always remain for those who dared to listen.